Joining us, former acting assistant attorney general for national security at the DOJ and MS Now legal analyst Mary McCord, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, host of The Beat, and MS Now chief legal reporter Ari Melber, and New York Times White House correspondent and MS Now contributor Peter Baker. All right, Ari, I'm going to start with you. Chuck Schumer called that slip, the I'm his lawyer slip, Freudian. What do you think?
Well, as you know, Freud believed that the unconscious mind was ultimately often more powerful and important than our actual conscious words. And the Freudian slip, the joke, was a reveal. So if you want to use that analysis, yeah, it sounded like that because he acts like he's his lawyer. He doesn't act like an independent attorney general. I thought the Republicans mostly tried to sort of paper over and kind of confuse some of these issues today. I thought Mr. Blanche had a poor hand that he played effectively because his style, his demeanor, his sort of, people saw it, his sort of assertively cool mode with both sides of the aisles questioning. Yeah, some might find it smug, others might find it even keeled, depends whether you like him. But that whole mode helped to try to detract from the reality that we are in a rule of law crisis, that he is part of that problem, a corruption crisis, where he hasn't done anything to deal with investigating and holding accountable corruption inside the government. Right now, he could appoint a special counsel. He could uphold law enforcement and anti-corruption parts of the DOJ. He hasn't done that on the job. And to the contrary, he's tried to hand out money to MAGA allied criminals, and then only under court pressure and Republican pressure backed off. And even then, as you saw with Cornyn, he just couldn't say, we're not going to do it, and therefore we're going to dissolve this agreement. And the whole thing is a scam because the lawyers you refer to are Trump's lawyers. So this idea of, oh, well, I wonder what they might do and what he referred to enforcing it. So I thought he got through the hearing, but I don't think he accorded himself with any great integrity.
Mary?
I agree with Ari. I would also say, he was very hyper-technical in his responses, too, so that he could be perceived potentially to people who are not as deep in it as those of us at the table are. He could be perceived to be answering a question, but he was doing so in such a hyper-technical way that it didn't really reveal anything about, his real answer. And I would also say we have more than just sort of him failing to investigate corruption within the department elsewhere. He's part of the corruption, right? I mean, what you were just talking about, Ari, the whole quote-unquote settlement agreement of a collusive lawsuit as found by Judge Williams just in an opinion on Monday was horribly corrupt. I mean, a corruption that led to not just this weaponization fund, this slush fund to pay out money to so-called victims of weaponization, but the complete and absolute civil and criminal immunity, not just for past tax liability, as Todd Blanche indicated, but for anything brought by any federal department or agency. That is what it says. He denied that, but it could be investigations based on facts up until the date of the settlement on May 15th that any department or agency could engage in. So it's total and complete civil and criminal immunity.
What did you make of John Cornyn really going after him on the settlement wording, the language? He put up a poster that had the language up on display, and he walked through it, as we just played a moment ago, with Todd Blanche. What do you make of that?
Well, Cornyn was the only Republican I saw that really did push, I think, Todd Blanche on anything with respect to his performance as a deputy attorney general. And, the fact that Blanche still denied what this settlement addendum does, even while the senator pointed out the language.
The words in front of him.
Yeah. Yes, the words are pretty clear. And I don't know if he never read the addendum. He denied later in an exchange with Ted Cruz, even knowing who typed it up when he was asked who wrote. No, I'm sorry, not with Ted Cruz. Who was that with? With somebody. I listened to all of these. Yes, Adam Schiff. That's right. Thank you, Lisa. He denied knowing who, quote unquote, typed it up, but somebody had to come up with its content. And his is the only name on that addendum.
Lisa.
Well, I think there's no question that Todd Blanche is smart. And the reason I say that is to go back to Mary's point about sort of the hyper-technical interpretations of questions. I saw that happen time and time again, and I want to give you and our viewers a few examples. He was asked by Alex Padilla about the possibility that January 6 defendants would still seek compensation through a federal law known as the Federal Tort Claims Act. The way that that works is you submit a claim on a pre-existing form, and then if you don't get a settlement from the Department of Justice within a particular period of time, then you can bring it to litigation. And so when he was asked, can you commit that you will not pay out January 6 defendants through the Federal Tort Claims Act, his answer was like, I can't block people from filing claims. Are you talking about the litigation? He never would say that this department would commit that it will not pay out on those claims. There was the whole, I don't know who typed it up, about the tax settlement exchange with Schiff. And then Cory Booker pressed him about the arrest of Ras Baraka outside Delaney Hall. That's the episode that led to the arrest and now the prosecution of LaMonica McIver, the member of Congress from New Jersey. And there is body camera footage on which an agent is basically saying it's time to arrest Mayor Baraka. It's been per order of the Deputy Attorney General. He's referring to Todd Blanche. He asked Todd Blanche, did you in fact order Mayor Baraka's arrest? And he said, well, I didn't order it. I authorized it. So there was a lot of hyper-technical, picayunish language today that shows Todd Blanche knows how to answer a question, but there were lots of unsatisfactory answers about any number of topics, including the Epstein files and how he's handled survivors.
Peter, what were your takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was fascinating on a couple of levels. One, he did try to distance himself a little bit at times from Trump. He was asked about impeaching judges, something that Trump has talked about, and he, disavowed that. He was asked about whether the president could run for re-election in 2028, something that he's kind of teased out there, maybe as a troll to his adversary, something he thought he might do despite the Constitution, and Blanche made clear no, he didn't think that was legal. But broadly speaking, he was on board, and obviously he was trying to appeal to, at this point, to an audience of two, Thom Tillis and John Cornyn. It seems like maybe he did succeed with Thom Tillis, who told him at the end of the hearing that he did a, quote, great job. But John Cornyn obviously will be the one who all eyes are on now from now on at this point. If John Cornyn says no, this is a nomination that it's hard to see how it advances out of the committee because they lost the vote of Lindsey Graham when he passed away last weekend. So John Cornyn, is a fascinating figure to watch. He's not a rebel. He's not a maverick. He's not a John McCain who goes onto the floor and gives a thumbs down in a very dramatic way. It's not his way, but he did lose that primary after Trump endorsed his opponent, Ken Paxton. He has nothing to lose, arguably, at this point. And he does seem genuinely offended by this agreement that gives Trump, audit-free, access to all the money he would have had to pay in back taxes. By the way, my colleagues reported that could be $100 million or more given interest. That's a personal benefit to the president of the United States. So that's what John Cornyn is thinking about. All eyes are going to be on him going forward.
Yeah, and that's why I asked the question the way I did at the end of the lead-in to all of you wonderful people that have joined me today. If Republicans weren't so afraid of Donald Trump, and I mean politically and I mean professionally, but I think do some personally as well, after January 6th, we saw how people were chased down in airports and the threats that they have to their lives. We heard it from the judges yesterday that were on Capitol Hill talking about the threats that they face. If they were not so afraid of Donald Trump, would more of them on that panel, would they have sounded more like John Cornyn with respect to Todd Blanche and everything that he's done so far as Deputy Attorney General, Peter?
I mean, that's a good question, right? No question that the president enforces loyalty in part through fear, fear of primaries, fear of backlash from the voters, fear of, some sort of punishment from the president in some way. Remember, this is a president whose administration, under Todd Blanche, by the way, as Deputy Attorney General, authorized the indictment of 5 Democratic senators who put together a video saying that U.S. troops should not follow illegal orders. He was trying to indict them for saying the law. Now, that didn't get passed by a grand jury, but that didn't mean that the administration didn't try to do it. Don't think people didn't pay attention to that. But I think if these senators had been grilling a Democratic nominee for Attorney General who had done some of the things that Todd Blanche had done, I think you would have heard a very different set of questions.
Yeah, and this is what frustrates me, and I'm sure many people out there, a lot of people out there, You feel like you're taking crazy pills. You have two separate hearings that you're watching with two separate priorities. The Republicans were all about mifepristone. The Democrats were all about corruption and him acting as a personal attorney. And I think if you're watching and you're not so schooled in the particulars of what has been going on, it is hard to figure out what's happening in Washington.
I had a similar reaction. We were maybe an hour in, and I thought, if you're just an average viewer, and no MS Now viewers are average viewers, but if you're an average viewer, you could tune in and think this was a run-of-the-mill confirmation hearing. There needed to be sort of an overarching statement at the outset, I think, from the Democrats. And I don't want to be overly political here, but to your point, like, it was like, you know,
two
as
different
Nicole
hearings.
Wallace says, Earth 1 and Earth 2, completely two different hearings, two alternate facts and everything else. And you know, I think we really need to, the Democrats, and I would say Republicans should be very concerned about the lack of independence of the Department of Justice and the lack of even any concern that there is a lack of independence.
It's like when you don't draw a line and you refuse to draw it, we get caught in these cycles, and we're going to keep doing a version of this where one side takes one issue and the other side takes the other issue, and they pretend like the others don't exist, or the others are taking their own crazy pills. And we're in this maze, and it's so hard to pull ourselves or find our way through it. Peter Baker, we're going to say goodbye to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to continue talking about this